Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Great Creators. This is where I have conversations with some of the most acclaimed artists, musicians, and performers of our time. And on the show today, the great and legendary Michael McDonald.
As she rises to her apology, anybody else would surely know.
Michael sang and played keys in not one but two legendary bands, Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers. And how he ended up in those bands? Pretty incredible story, which you will hear on the show today. You'll also learn about his songwriting process, his reaction to being parodied on South Park and Family Guy.
How's he gonna help us?
He's gonna do backup vocals for everything we say.
How's he gonna know what we're saying?
Know what we're saying.
And how Michael's been able to stay creative for more than 50 years, despite feeling a lot of self-doubt and self-consciousness along the way. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with the great Michael McDonald. Thank you for, as I say, for joining us on the show. Let's start. Let's go back to where you grew up, because you actually grew up in a place that most people would never have heard of before, until, of course, recently, in recent years, when it was in the news. You grew up in Ferguson, Missouri.
That's right. A small town outside of St. Louis. It was even smaller back then in the 50s is when my parents moved out that way. And we always had strong ties to the city. My grandparents lived in the city, and a lot of our families and friends were in the city. But my folks, my dad with the help of the GI Bill, and my grandmother helping out a little bit with some inheritance money she had gotten, they were able to buy a house out in this suburb that had just been built in Ferguson. And I remember I was about 4. One of my more vivid memories of that age is, believe it or not, a few things I remember. One of them is the first night I spent in Ferguson. It was our phase of the development of the suburb was ended at the dairy farm that was being sold off in parcels to build this subdivision. And I heard cows for the first time through my window. And I had no idea what they were. I thought they were ghouls, coming to get me. And I ran down the hall scared. My father, talked me back into bed and told me it's just a cow, But I was a city kid up until 4.5.
So I know as a kid, your dad, he was an amateur singer, right? I mean, this is not what he did for a living, but he did regularly sing, like do gigs in local bars.
Yes, he did. He had a beautiful voice and a great style of singing too. My dad, I always knew, even back then, listening to him, that he just had a way with making the lyrics come to life when he sang. And I always loved that about his. I always admired that about his singing. For instance, Danny Boy was his big number. He was a big lanky Irishman who with a tenor voice, and so of course it was a natural to sing Danny Boy. And he just had a way with that song that people always requested him to sing it, and the words of that song are so beautiful. And he was I remember even as a little kid, having to fight back the tears whenever I heard him sing Danny Boy. It was just
Wow.
the words came to life, and he was like that, with most songs he interpreted, and I think I learned from him, or inherited from him, I should say, his great love of songwriters and great songs. That was my dad. If I could say anything about him, that I remember, so much I remember about him. But one of the things I always felt like I inherited from him was that love of a good song and a great lyric.
Michael, what kind of kid were you? I'm gonna guess you were a little bit of an introverted kid, because later on we're gonna talk about your approach to being a stage performer, which you had to grow into. Were you a kind of a quiet kid a little bit?
I guess I was. I was kind of a living paradox in a way, because I was one of those kids that I was very shy on the inside, but I was always stepping in it. I was always uh, being an extrovert at the wrong time, and opening my mouth at the wrong. I just seemed to be one of those people. I came from a family where sarcasm was king. It was an Irish Catholic family, and
Yeah.
everybody was pretty had a certain wit about them, and a sense of the irony, and they would never hesitate to point it out, with each other. And I was kind of a shrinking violet in this environment as a kid. I remember feeling that way, like I couldn't really keep up with them. And at the same time, I would try to, and when I did, it was usually a failed experiment, and it only served to make me feel even more of a shrinking violet, But like my dad, for instance, I just idolized the guy growing up, and he was almost quite naturally that guy that everybody loved. The guy,
Hmm.
he a wicked sense of humor. He was a very dry sense of humor, and uh, I always could tell people enjoyed seeing him and enjoyed talking to him because he was a kind of he was a hoot, and without really trying to be, and he just seemed to be very at ease with himself, and uh, and I never was that way. I just always I aspired to be like him, but I kind of always believed I never would be.
As a kid in the 50s into the 60s, really, St. Louis was a really important jazz and blues town when you were growing up. Do you remember being exposed to that kind of music? I mean,
Mhm.
I'm assuming it was more of a segregated city then, although it still is today. Do you remember listening to black music as a kid?
Yes, and it was very segregated, first of all, in the 50s, and that's a sad thing because the real culture of St. Louis, the real unique culture of St. Louis in terms of art, and was largely inspired and uh, invented, if you will, by African American
Hmm.
population. Our music was something that, you know, W.C. Handy, all the blues artists coming up. There were bands back then. I remember going to a fish fry of all things.
A church fry?
Well, it was actually a little place called the Shady Grove in
Mhm.
Jennings, Missouri, and it was it was like a beer garden, like an outdoor thing, and they on Friday they served fish, so all the Catholic families would go there for
Right,
for their fish
right.
quota or whatever. And there was a band playing. It was like a quartet, and I believe looking back that it was the Oliver Sane band, and they were an important band in St. Louis music culture, in the 50s and 60s. Um, every bit like Ike Turner kind of came out of that
Hmm.
same full, there were those great bands in St. Louis that played at the hot spots in St. Louis, Club Imperial, on the east side, a lot of places like the Blue Note Club and places like that. And Oliver Sane was one of those bands that really they were on the map in St. Louis. And I remember hearing them, I believe, and they were playing at this place, and it was interesting because they were playing music I hadn't really been that familiar with, and What I Say was one of the songs they were playing that night.
Hmm.
And it was the first time I ever heard a real bass, live bass guitar, and it was just like, wow, what is that? And because the most bass you heard was on a jukebox back then, and that's why everybody loved jukeboxes because it had that robust kind of sound that really, especially with rock and roll, that really came across. But to hear it live and to hear it a big Fender P bass, and the guy was just going to town, and uh, one of the guy that was singing was playing a whirly piano. It just sounded just like the record to me, of the Ray Charles record. Uh, and I remember being very impressed by realizing that this was something different. This was, uh, a style of music. It was like the first time I ever heard Ray Charles as a kid.
Hmm.
I remember thinking, I just know this guy never sings this song the same way twice. He's just so in the moment. He was just so expressive and so soulful. beyond anything I'd heard up to that point. And uh, so that's when soul music really first got my attention as it was as a little kid. It really, my dad loved all the crooners, Tony Bennett,
Mm,
Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and he loved Ray Charles. And so in his old Ford Fairlane with the Delco radio, I remember I
yeah.
could hardly see over the dashboard, but when Ray Charles came on, it was like the whole world filled up with
Stop.
that voice,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At what age did you discover that you had a voice?
Well, I don't know that I would ever really was ever the best authority on whether I did or didn't. I when I was 4, they put me on they let me sing. Uh, I asked them to let me sing. My dad was a singer, and I would always go with him to these places where he'd sing, and he'd uh, he'd get his Pepsi Cola. My dad didn't drink; he just went to bars to sing. And so he'd get his Pepsi Cola, and I'd get a Shirley Temple, and thankfully the bartender was kind enough to call it a Roy Rogers, so I didn't feel too bad about it. But I would sit on the windowsill behind the piano player and watch my dad sing at
Oh,
the microphone and watch the piano players play. And I when I got up there, I was about 5 when the first time I ever got up. I tugged the lady's sleeve, the piano player, and I said, "I'd like to sing a song." And she just kind of looked at me, and she was a friend of my dad's, and he was her favorite singer. So she just looked. She goes, "Well, what do you want to sing, honey?" And I said, "Love is a many splendored thing." It's like a Mario Lanza song, kind of an opera song, almost. And I had heard it on the 78 recording at my aunt's house on her old Victrola. She showed me how to wind up the Victrola. So I played that record. It was the only record she had over and over. And I learned all the words. And so I thought, well, I'm going to get up there and sing that song. And I sang it at about 5 years old. I clocked in a little closer to Alfalfa than Mario Lanza, I'm sure. But when I got done, the place just erupted in hysterics, laughter, and clapped and applauded for me. And I thought that they thought I was really a great singer. So that was it for me from that day on. That's how I saw myself as singing songs for whatever audience would listen.
you were a high school student in the late 60s, and I think you graduated maybe in 70, 69, 70. And you were at that point playing keyboard. I mean, you were largely self-taught, and you've been playing in bands. And I mean, at that point in your life when you're 17, 18 years old, did you think that that was how you were going to make a living, that was a career path you were going to follow, a musician?
I hoped it would be. I didn't know what the chances were. And oddly enough, my parents were always supportive of me, but my dad was a little apprehensive about it all. He was always quick to remind me that the odds aren't that great.
No,
And
no.
when he was in the Marines in World War II in the Pacific, he actually had the opportunity to sing with Bob Crosby and the Bobcats, which was a band, kind of a big band, that toured the USO clubs in the Pacific and for guys that were on R&R. And so I think my dad thought that maybe that would be a break for him, and it never really. He learned real quick that the odds of in the music business weren't that great. It was most people were disappointed by their efforts, and so he was always afraid of that for me. He
Mhm.
always wanted me to get. I dropped out of high school to go start touring with bands or playing with bands, and my folks were split up, and he wasn't happy about that. And he let me, he allowed me to do it for whatever reason, but uh, he always wanted me to get my GED. Always wanted me to get that high school equivalency test, which when I finally did it, I was out in California for a while and the bottom dropped out for me and I had to come home. And so I promised him I would do the GED before I left again. And you know, a mildly clever chimpanzee could pass the GED. I mean, it wasn't know, you needed to study or anything. But uh, and I remember at that point in time thinking, well, maybe I will need this someday. I don't know, if I give this up. So I was always kind of a give and take there as far as having real faith in the fact that I would do this for a living. I was persistent because I was more stubborn than anything. And
Mm.
so I went out there and I kind of inherited that from my mom, my stubbornness. I inherited my musical, and I think one of the reasons I'm a musician today was if my mother trusted my father more, I probably wouldn't have been a musician because when he'd come home from work, he was, he'd have dinner and he was getting ready to, he would always want to go out and sing somewhere. And coming home from the war and having a little bit of PTSD and kind of always having to be moving, he always had a foot out the door. And uh, my mother would let him, go sing. She felt like it was good for him. But she would always remind him that he hadn't seen me all day, so maybe he should take me along. So I would tag along with my dad to all these saloons while he sang, and the idea was he would get home early with me, which almost never happened, but it would keep him out of trouble, because most of his ardent fans were females. They all loved his voice, and he was a good-looking guy. So my mom, you know, I was the designated spoiler, for this whole routine they had.
Michael, when you were just 18, you were discovered at a nightclub in Illinois by a producer who basically said, "Hey, let's bring you out to LA and make a record." I mean, that was to sort of get to the end of the story. It did not turn out well, but that was potentially a huge break at that time, right? You're 18, go out to
Yeah.
LA, make a record. Tell me what happened. You presumably you took the offer, you went out to LA.
Well, reality happened is what it was. I mean, the guy was a great producer, and I owe him so much
Rick
because
Gerard was his name, I think.
yeah, Rick Gerard. He
Yeah.
gave me so much experience I wouldn't have gotten any other way. And what happened was, it wasn't a slam dunk. It wasn't a done deal when he asked me to come out to California. He had heard a demo I'd made with my band, and he came down to the club to hear me sing. And so got a kind of he was starting an independent production company himself. So he got some seed money from RCA Records, where he had been a staff producer. And in exchange, he would bring his acts. They would get right of first refusal, on his acts. So I was one of the first acts he signed, and he brought me out to California with some money they gave him as an advance towards making a demo with me to see if they wanted to sign me. And he uh, he knew I wrote songs and he had listened to my songs, but he wanted to really make a good impression on this demo with RCA to secure a deal for me as an artist. So he brought me this song that he'd gotten from Dick James Music by this young songwriting team that no one had ever heard of. They were an English songwriting team, and they wrote songs for this publisher, Dick James, and they went by the name of Elton John and Bernie Taupin.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
And they brought me this song called "Take Me to the Pilot." Little did I know that they had already cut this album on Elton, and Dick James, the guy from Dick James, was just sending it out as like a publishing demo. But I cut it with some of the guys, some of these musicians out there in California and LA. Ronnie Tutt, James Burton on guitar, Jerry Sheff on bass, and these guys were kind of like, in some form or fashion, part of the Wrecking Crew, legacy out there in California. I think they were Elvis's band at the time, and so I cut the song, got the deal with RCA, and then got dropped immediately. By the time we finished the record, I think they were already pretty much sure they were going to drop me. And
Wow.
but they, to their credit, they went the expense of making this record with me, and And Rick did a great job producing it. The songs were terrible, but that's was just where I was at that point. But what happened for me that was really important was Rick started using me on all his sessions to write chord charts, any kind of miscellaneous task he could give me, and it always wound up with me playing on the dates, which I had no business being in the room with those musicians and playing on the floor with them, and but Rick kind of used me
Hmm.
that way to keep me alive in California while I was living out there.
Michael, I'm curious. I mean, here you are, 18, 19-year-old in California in the early 70s. I mean, now, I guess any time really is legendary. But when I think about that time, I think of like Joni Mitchell and David Crosby and Graham Nash, all these things happening and like, Topanga Canyon and just that world. But I want to ask about your voice at the time, right? Because we're going to talk more about this because your voice is so distinct and so unique and is so almost precedes you. Your voice, and then Michael McDonald comes in the room like it has its own identity. How did you I mean, were you singing in a baritone in that baritone style with the same kind of voice control, or was it something that would develop over time? Like what did you sound like in 1970?
Uh, it's hard for me to say. I probably sounded a little closer to what I sound like now, but not quite. I was a little more of I really aspired to be like Tom Jones. I thought he was
Mm,
a fabulous singer, and I still do. And but it was that kind of music. Like I loved Burt Bacharach songs. I loved "It's Not Unusual." The song that Tom
that
had.
rich, deep
Yeah,
Tom
and I
Jones. Yeah.
love that kind of pop music. I wasn't a folk singer. And I wasn't a blues guy or anything. I was just unabashed, unashamedly uh, infatuated with a great pop song. Like I say, Burt Bacharach, Hal David. I loved Broadway songs. Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein. But I loved the Beatles and I loved the Stones and I loved all the stuff that people my age loved. And it was in bands that we played all that stuff.
Yeah.
um, and rhythm and blues bands back in St. Louis where we had horn sections and we were kind of like R&B dance bands, one of the top three R&B dance bands in the St. Louis area. Um, but I think down deep, I really loved that. I still loved the kind of songs my dad loved. I loved those Broadway musical songs. Stephen Sondheim songs. I loved uh, Reach Out for Me and, all those great songs that those guys wrote. Uh, and uh, and I think if I saw myself as anything, I would have been happy to do that. I would have been happy to have been a male Dionne Warwick or a
Hmm.
Tom Jones, kind of guy making pop records. Um, but I played on a lot of different stuff. I played on Rick did a lot of folk artists, kind of, and he was producing Jose Feliciano at the time, and John Hartman, and so Harry Nilsson, he just gotten done doing a couple albums with Harry Nilsson, and believe it or not, his first big record was "Surrealistic Pillow" by Jefferson Airplane.
Huh.
He had quite
A roster.
a roster of artists that he
Yeah.
had produced, and so I was looking forward to whatever he was doing. At that time, he was doing an album with Jack Jones and David Cassidy, and lo and behold, they did a couple. Both of them each did one of my songs
That you had written.
that I had written in it. So I had high hopes,
Yeah.
but it was going to be a longer haul than I realized. But I think that's just normal. I think most people, we look at our best laid plans, and those are just, kind of comical, really. In the end, you just don't. That usually never goes that way.
You were mainly doing, from what I understand, like just performing at parties and doing, sort of a musician for hire, and in LA at the time. And I'm assuming you were just singing a lot of standards or and sort of popular songs of the time.
Sure. Well, we did a lot of we played a lot of dance clubs. What were basically discos before discos and DJs came around. There were these clubs, and they were all around the LA area, mostly Orange County, San Gabriel Valley. We play everything from like the corner bar to these dance clubs where the whole idea was keep them dancing, you know. So
Right.
we would play we all kind of knew about 2 hours worth of the songs that would have been considered disco back then, which was like War, Tower of Power,
Yeah.
Steely Dan, even, Doobie Brothers, and people loved to dance to those songs. Wilson Pickett, whenever there was a dance contest, it was like we would, you know, uh, bait our breath because we knew we were going to play Mustang Sally at least 100 times that night for
Yeah.
every couple who wanted to do their thing on the dance floor,
Yeah.
But those were the songs, and that was what disco was, prior to the Bee Gees really reshaping the whole thing, and a lot of the disco acts that came out during the 80s and 90s. Disco was kind of a little more of a primitive, but there were those clubs. The Rain Tree was a club I remember in LA we used to play all the time, and that was one of the kind of premier dance clubs. So people just went there to dance, and you better know the stuff they want to dance to, So that was kind of what I did a lot of.
Michael, I mean, people who know a little bit about you, I would like you to tell the story, know that you really got your first big break with Steely Dan. But from what I understand, the way the story goes is they were looking for a pianist, a keyboardist, and that was the opportunity. You kind of jumped at this chance to maybe audition to play the keys for them.
Well, it was one of those random connections that happen that again have nothing to do with the plans you might have laid out. When I
Yeah.
came to California, I thought I was going to make an album, go home in a couple weeks, and wait to hear it on the radio. But I stayed about 5 years in LA and played nightclubs and played some sessions. I was lucky to get those sessions, and it put me in touch in the company of a lot of people that. Uh, I remember hearing about a kid. I was on playing the session at A&M Studios. I forget for who, but it was Rick Gerard was the producer, and Al Jackson was a guitar player, one of the a session player, and he was on that date, and he was telling the producer about this young kid who was 15, and he was somebody's son, but he was already like a world-class drummer, and he had his studio etiquette all together. He could come in and be a real pro on this on a major recording master recording session, and his drums sounded great. He knew how to read. He was doing really. It was amazing for how young he was. And it turns out that was Jeff Porcaro that he was talking about. And I would run into Jeff a little later when Jeff was still only 16. I was playing. I was about 19 then, playing this club out in the valley, and Jeff's band, they were like junior high school uh, jazz ensemble, and they came into this club and played all instrumentals, but they were great, and impressive. And about a year later, I maybe talked to him that night briefly, but not much, and
And Jeff was 15 at the time.
well, Jeff by now was, 19 or 20,
Okay. So still a young guy. This is years before he would found Toto, of
yeah,
course.
exactly.
But he was just he was a well-known, talented, skilled drummer.
Yeah, and well, to make a long story short, which I'm not doing a very good job of,
That's okay.
he called me out of the blue. We were friends through a mutual friend of ours, a girl I was dating, a bass player, great bass player, Brandy Binto, and she informed me that she had this gig she wanted to do. It was a better than usual paying gig for a rap party on Universal Studios lot for the show Emergency with Kevin Ty and Randy Mantooth. And she was friends with them, and they hired her to put a band together for this rap party. She said, "Look, I got to go to Vegas because I got this audition with the Harry James Orchestra, and it could be a like a years long gig. I can't not go to this audition because, she had a little girl, and this might be uh, something where she had to either move to Vegas, but would be work that was meaningful for her. She said, will you do this gig for me? You got to get the musicians, you got to get the band, you got to get the gear, you've got to come up with the songs, you got to do all this stuff." She goes, "I know you. Don't wait till the last minute. You got on this early." I said, "Oh, no, no problem. I got it." So cut to about a week before, 5 days before the gig, I've got no one except a sax player that I'm sitting with in my kitchen, and I'm singing the blues. I'm explaining to him how screwed I am right now. There's no way I'm going to get this band together, and this gig is pending in 5 days, and you're the only guy I have so far. I have no gear, no PA. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so he says, "Man," he goes, "calm down." He goes, "I know some cats. They're friends of my brother's. His brother happened to own a big rehearsal hall and gear rental, like SIR kind of place, one of the early places in LA." And he said, "My brother can get us the gear. These guys are doing a session right now, but they're working from like 10 to 6 and they don't go into the evenings. The artist doesn't like to work into the evening. So they'll probably be available and they probably would love to do it just for kicks." I said, "Well, if they're playing sessions, this money isn't that good, you know." And he goes, because these guys don't need the money. They'll just do it for fun, probably if they
Right.
can do." So I said, "Well, that would be like too good to be true, the fact that I could actually snatch defeat from victory from the jaws of defeat at this point was a miracle." And so he called these guys, and I said, "Well, we need to rehearse. He goes, "These guys don't need to rehearse." He says, "You just make the chord charts, pick the keys for the songs that you can sing them in, do them just like the record so they're familiar with what's going on, and make these simple chord charts, and everybody will be fine." So when I got to the gig, the drummer he had found was Jeff Porcaro, Mike Porcaro on bass. Uh, David Page came down and played some keyboards, Kent Henry on guitar, and myself. And we pretty much just faked it all night long. We did 2 hours of music. People were happy. These guys were fantastic, and they were, we were really just kind of improvising the whole night, and they were wonderful at that. And on one of the breaks, we went outside and we had a cigarette break, and Jeff was telling me about this album he's working on. That he just cut a track that day called Pretzel Logic, which would wind up being the title track of the record. And I remember thinking, God, I'm so jealous. That was my favorite band at the time, my favorite band since the Beatles at that point in time.
Wow.
And I said, man, I cannot believe how lucky this guy is. I'm thinking to myself, how do you get a gig like that? And so this is a year later. I get this phone call through my girlfriend, and she gives me his number. I call him. He says, "Oh man, I'm glad you called." He goes, I was mentioning you to Donald and Walter. Could you come down and audition? We're at Modern Music rehearsing." And I'm thinking, well, I got to, barnstorm on these songs. I don't know that many of their songs. I know the
Yeah.
hits. And I said, "Well, sure. How much time do I got? I mean, when do you want to rehearse?" He goes, "Like right now." And so I'm throwing my piano in my Ford Pinto and going down to Modern Music within an hour. I go in there, they set me up. I meet all the guys. Donald teaches me some songs, and I think what got me the gig was I could sing all the high parts in my head voice or my almost natural voice.
Yeah.
Donald loved that, and Walter loved that too. So that's more than my piano playing, certainly. That's what got me the gig. And I could,
Donald Fagen, Walter Becker are in that room, and you are literally, you're like, you've got to audition right then and there. And
Yeah, I
it
would.
wasn't your keyboard playing that was impressive to them. It was the fact that you could hit the high notes.
Yeah, and I that audition more or less turned into a rehearsal, which parlayed into a week's of
Wow.
rehearsal.
And
And
these guys were your heroes.
oh, they
Steely
were.
Dan.
They were. That was like to me a dream come true. And I, of course, to my way of thinking, some other shoe's got to fall here. It's going to drop any minute. Something bad's going to happen. This couldn't possibly work out to my favor, but it did. And I wound up touring with them for that better part of that year. And then we even went on to tour in Europe after that, a few months later.
And and it was at that time, I think, around that time, Steely Dan, Walter Becker, and Donald Fagen decide essentially to be a studio band and not to tour anymore. They would, of course, pick it up again
Yeah.
decades
It
later.
seemed
But
really natural to me. Of course, I was waiting for something like that. It seems like every time you got a good gig in this business, I remember Timothy Schmidt and I talking about this, laughing about this once. He goes, "Yeah, man," because he and I sang on sessions, as background sessions together years before he got in the Eagles, and he was still with Poco back then, and I was just knocking around town, but kind of with Steely Dan on and off, But I remember him saying, "Yeah, man," he goes, "You know what our fate is? We get these gigs, the gig of a lifetime, and the band breaks up."
yeah,
Which
yeah,
is basically what happened to him and what happened to me with Steely Dan was Donald and Walter disbanded the whole group, which was hard on the original guys,
yeah.
and because they had put a lot of time and sweat and blood into it, but it was a natural. I remember I was with Denny Diaz when I heard about this, and he was very philosophical about it. He knew those guys really well, and of all the guys, he seemed to be, to understand what they were doing, what was going on with them. He goes, man, he goes, this is the natural evolution for Donald and Walter.
Mm.
This is where they need to go to do what they need to do in the future. And as it turns out, all those gems that we remember, by them from Asia and Royal Scam and, Gaucho, those songs would have never happened had they remained. I don't think, had they remained in the unit that they were as the original band. It was Donald and Walter and putting in countless hours writing
Yeah.
make those records and picking just the right musicians to play on those tracks as they saw fit, and really paying attention to the details of making those albums in a way they couldn't if they were touring, because the labels were always famous back then for shoving you back out on the road.
Right.
And
What
so you're making a record for them became, especially if you had a hit, then it became like you had to fight for your time to get back in the studio and make the next record.
what I mean, I from what I understand, I mean, understandably, this was a difficult moment for you because you got the gig of a lifetime and then it ended. And I think you were, I mean, looking back on it now, fate kind of intervened, right? Like, let's say the hand of God or whatever, because had you been employed as Steely Dan, the next opportunity might not have come up. But from what I understand, you were kind of down on your luck at the time. Like you were living in a garage in Burbank, like you were broke. What was going after
Well,
that
I was
Steely
always
Dan? Yeah.
I was a professional couch surfer at that point in time.
Even
I
though you had vocals on Katie Lied and you were on Steely Dan songs, I mean, you were broke.
I was sleeping on couches, yeah. But
Wow.
I was when I got into my garage apartment, that was like things were looking up. It was like, you I had a board and two cinder blocks and a black and white TV and an illegal bathroom with a sink where I washed my dishes and shaved. And that was in the shower, so I showered there too. But that was just I, my particular case had a little bit to do with I brought my sisters and my mom out from Missouri, St. Louis. My mom's dream was to move to uh, California. And so my sister Kathy and I kind of we kind of made that move for her, and So rather than live in the house with these three women who I love dearly, but that would be a recipe for, mental disaster for me. I would, kind of stay out for the week, usually staying with friends and playing those gigs, staying at one of the guys' places or maybe some girlfriend I had at the time. But I was a kind of pretty much a couch server,
Mhm.
and pretty much the entire sum of my life was in my car.
I mean,
Uh,
it was in those circumstances where you're essentially sounds like you really don't have a lot of cash and you're living, as you say, out of your car or couch surfing. It was in that context in which an offer would come your way that would actually change your life.
yeah, sure it was. Uh, yeah, I Jeff Baxter had, he was, like myself, just uh, he had an apartment that he rented.
And Jeff was the guitarist for the
He
Doobie
was a
Brothers. I just
guitarist in
mentioned,
Steely
yes.
Dan.
Yep.
But Jeff never came off the road. He was never there. He would be out on the road with the, who, God knows who, uh, Doobie Brothers, Elton John,
Yeah.
and whoever was ending their tour, he would just make a phone call and fly to the next tour and go on that. And he was just trying to, we were all kind of living paycheck to paycheck, at that point. It was, if in a way, it was like we were making good money at a certain stage, but it was a musician's lifestyle of just, yeah, we did live with a checking account, cash. We weren't really business people. We weren't really very smart with our money. We just, we got the best apartment we could afford, and we someplace to keep our gear, and we always looked, we were always looking at the next gig, whatever that was. And so uh, Jeff called me, uh, much like the call I got from Jeff McCarl, and he said, "Hey, uh, Doobies are on the road, and I'm out with them right now, and Tommy's, been kind of ill lately, and he had to kind of come off the road and get some medical help, back in San Francisco. The band wants to finish out this tour, and so I mentioned you and that you could probably help us with some vocals and play and bring keyboards because they hadn't had a keyboard player up to that point.
Hmm.
So and they were all kind of up for that idea because Bill Payne had figured so heavily into some of their recordings. Uh, and I was a little nervous because I'm no Bill Payne, but I thought, well, I could probably cover the stuff, and I'm not going to say no. And I mentioned to him, I don't really have a lot of money right now. I don't know how I'll get down to New Orleans. He goes, "There's a ticket waiting for you. There'll be per diem when you get here, so you have money to operate on while we're on the road, and it'll be a thousand, $1,500 a week, which was like unheard of money,
Well,
to me. I didn't Steely Dan.
can I just interrupt you for a moment? Sorry to interrupt, but the Doobie Brothers were a huge band.
Yeah, they were. They were.
They were asking you to be the front man of the band.
Yeah.
Was any
Well,
part of you like, oh my God, this is kind of scary. Like I'm gonna be the
yeah.
front man of this band that millions of people love and know their music.
Well, I was a little trepidatious about all of it, about because the the void that Tommy left, as you can imagine, was huge. Of all the people to not go, he and Pat were the guys. They wrote all the songs. They sang the songs. So either one of those guys not being there was a huge void, and I'm walking into this and I'm thinking, I had kind of I was all about the exercise of don't think too much, just say yes and do it, because those were the things that would work out in surprising ways, and this was one of them. And so I rehearsed with them for 2 days, learned the whole show, and then we finished out the tour for the better part of that year. We were out for like 6 months after that and wound up in Hawaii,
Hmm.
kind of like a gig. The last gig was kind of designed to afford the band 2 weeks in Kauai for some R&R, and that was, bedlam to say the least.
Well, Michael, tell me what that was like. You get this call, hey, come to New Orleans and sing our music, right? And in front of presumably thousands of people. I mean, you're like living couch surfing in LA, and all of a sudden, like a few days later, you're going to be on a stage in front of 10,000, maybe more people with the Doobie Brothers. What was that experience like for you? I mean, was any part of you just
It,
terrified?
it, was- it was surreal. It really was. And Jeff had totally gone, put his endorsement on the line. It wasn't like I auditioned. He told them I could come in and cover this thing and that, not to worry. And I will be forever grateful to him for having that faith in me and putting his relationship with these guys on the line like that. And I remember that first gig so well because we were in New Orleans. My father was living in New Orleans at the time. So I got together with him for dinner after our rehearsals, and the next night was my first gig with him in Shreveport. So he and I made plans, and I okayed it with the road manager that I would drive up with him to the gig. He made sure I knew where it was and all that. And so we and I drove up there. We found this venue, and it was this big circular arena. And I'm thinking, this is a huge building. And we found the backstage door, which is not easy in a round building, but we saw where the trucks were. We went in and we did the sound check. And all of a sudden, from rehearsal, now I'm 10 feet away from the nearest guy on this huge stage
Yeah.
in an empty arena, uh, playing louder than I ever dreamed we would play, with this huge PA. And so by the time the gig came on, and they had these catered meals and dinners and all that, it was like first rate kind of thing. My dad, I'm sure, was thinking, who's paying for all this? Uh, so he and I went up on stage before the show while the house lights were up and people were coming into their seats. And my road manager said, "You want to sit on stage and watch the show?" My dad said, "Sure." And so I went up with him and sat next to him while I waited for the band to come out. And sitting there with my dad and the house lights up, I'm watching this place fill up, and there's like 10, 15,000 people, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
wow. And they're all expecting to see Tommy Johnston, and I'm going to get up there and sing one of his songs. I don't know how that's going to go. But sitting there with my dad, and all of a sudden the road manager says, "You ready?" And I go, "Yeah, sure. I'll just stay right here. When the band comes up, I'll just walk out. The house lights go out. The crowd goes up in a massive roar, singular massive roar. And the drummers are already up there they're starting off Jesus.
And everybody knows Tom Johnston's not going to be there.
What's that?
The audience knows that Tom Johnston is not going to be there.
I don't know that they did,
Huh.
it wasn't like it was made real public or anything, but
Yeah.
so the drummers start the thing and the crowd is just, gone up in a giant roar and are on their feet already. And I'm thinking, the last time my dad heard me play was in Panorama Bowling Alley, the lounge in Belleville, Illinois.
In front of like 25 people.
Yeah, well, maybe, and here we are playing in front of these people. So I'm trying to imagine what he's thinking,
Yeah.
hoping that he's thinking, well, maybe I made the right choice in my career. But anyway, it was a night of a lot of just a whole new awareness for me, and of course when I sang the couple songs I sang, I felt like I was strapped to the nose of an Atlas rocket with
Yeah.
the band, and I could
Bet.
hear people in the crowd, like, "Where's Tommy?" And but we got through it, and Tom did come back for a while. He had some serious health issues, stuff with his gut back then that was
Yeah.
really crucial to his health, and so he didn't really have a choice. And we finished out the tour. Um, then there was a period of time when I don't, I think Tom was looking towards maybe doing a solo career. He did a
Yeah.
solo album, great solo album, and but I think a lot of it had to do with accommodating his health issues at the time. That kind of touring and that grind was just too much. And the
Yeah.
rest of us would over the years all kind of take turns buckling here and there with it all, and we went through a few road managers in those days too.
Michael, I know you were brought on originally as a temporary replacement for Tom Johnston, but of course you would become the frontman for the Doobie Brothers. Obviously many people know the hit Taking It to the Streets, but when you got there to just fill in for him, right? You had to perform Listen to the Music and Jesus Is Just All Right and Black Water and China Grove. Like, you had to sing those hit songs. Were you trying to channel Tom Johnston, or did you go into it saying, I've got this voice and I'm going to apply my sound to these songs?
Oh, I think I was just trying to sing as best I could. I wasn't really
Yeah.
thinking about too much of. I love the songs. I still to this day.
Well, beautiful songs.
One of my main reasons for coming back with the Doobies for the 50th was I love the hang and I love everybody in the band. We're all good friends for many years, but I love that book of songs that we play. I love Tom's and Pat's songs as much as I love my own, and I missed playing them, over the years. Even though I did a solo thing for a long time, and that was something different for me. But I always missed the Doobie Brothers songbook.
Yeah.
Um, but Pat and I split the songs. Pat did a lot of Tommy's, took over a lot of Tommy's songs, and I took over the other half of them for the times that Tom wasn't there.
Yeah.
And Pat was really guy pretty much the front man for he's always when Tom wasn't there, he took over that role as front man. Tom did that for the most part when the guys were all together. And when Tom was gone, Pat kind of stepped into that role, and he was really not just the front man to the audiences on the shows, but Pat was also, as far as all of us thought or could see, uh, held the leadership capacity of the band. He was the guy we all looked to,
Yeah.
band conscience, and we all kind of looked to his guidance in terms of what and where and how the band should operate on any number of levels.
Michael, how did you handle? I mean, even though you weren't, as you say, the front man in quite the same way as Pat or as Tom had been, you were still very visible. I mean, you were singing hit songs, Grammy-winning songs, "What a Fool Believes," Minute by Minute. Um, uh, wh- how did you feel on stage? Because I read a quote that you gave to an interviewer at one point, maybe back in the day, and you said, I'm not that comfortable on stage as a person.
Yeah, no, over the years, even from the time I was a little kid, I kind of developed this, like I was saying earlier, my family, everybody there in my family seemed to have the confidence to just speak their mind whenever. And I kind of learned to make a point to not speak my mind because I usually kind of would be a regretful situation because I just wasn't that good at that, and so as an entertainer, I kind of felt the same way. I felt like I loved being the guy who got to play keyboards, got to write songs for the band, got to sing those songs live. But I was so comfortable with Pat doing all the talking because I really did not want to do that. I didn't want to have that responsibility of kind of keeping things rolling, kind of a master of ceremonies, if you will.
Yeah.
Pat always did it really well. He was always very sincere, and the audience always really kind of loved his persona on stage. So, it was a win-win for all of us, and especially for me, because I had no desire whatsoever to take on that role.
But presumably you started to get public attention, media attention. Like, who's this guy, Michael McDonald? I mean, you'd gone from being a sort of a session musician for Steely Dan to a pretty visible role. Did that happen? Did you start to get attention that you had to kind of figure out? Like here we are now. I mean, you're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but you're doing an interview now. But did you have to start doing those things, and how did you navigate that at the time?
It's a learning curve, you know. I mean, when it started to happen and the publicist started to pull me in for interviews with the band and things, um, you know, you learn uh what to do and what not to do real quick in an interview. You know, you learn that you know, you don't uh you don't enter certain subject matter in an interview that you if you don't want it to be blown out of proportion, you know, like I remember one interview I did, I mentioned to a guy something about feeling you know that you know we would smoke a little pot on the road or something, and you
Yeah,
know that just became you know like a you know a you know drug addict Mike McDonald, you know,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it seemed like that was what the guy focused on, you know, was it the music and what it was we were doing out there, and what our relationship with our audience was became very little of the article, and the article became the hook was that I might possibly have a drug problem, which I did, but you know,
yeah,
it wasn't to the guy's credit. He understood that maybe more than I did at the time, but I remember that, you know, don't bring that up in an
yeah,
interview. Don't bring up you know, anything that you might do recreational or being bored on the road, because it'll be perceived as, you know, bouts of depression while on the road, you know. Uh, but and I think that was kind of what the subject matter was. I talked about how boring it can be on the road, with that, you know, we're you know, moving is the best, you know, sometimes is the best part of the day, because otherwise you're in a hotel room and you're not really, you know, doing much but watching television and you know, deciding to go eat again, you know.
yeah.
So, but you know, um,
Michael, when Patrick Simmons left the band, right? This is around 82. The Doobie Brothers tried to continue on, but you all kind of decided it just wasn't working, and the band kind of split, right? And was that, I mean, you had this sort of 7 year period of being in one of the biggest bands in the United States. Um, what do you remember about that period? I mean, did you go through like I don't know, a low point? Did you kind of feel like, did your career stall for a brief period of time, or, you know, what do you remember about your state of mind? I mean, you had a date. I mean, your solo debut album would come out that year, but I wonder when the Doobie Brothers broke up, did you feel like kind of like how you felt when the Steely Dan thing ended?
kind of, yeah. I remember it seemed like after the Doobies broke up, that was a tricky thing too, because I'm not even sure that a lot of people in the organization weren't mad at me as if I did it. We showed up at a rehearsal ostensibly to rehearse the show without Pat, with the idea that we might go out and tour as the Doobie Brothers.
Hmm.
And I remember the first song playing it down, and I just, you know, I think I just stopped and decided that somebody's got to say it, and I'm only saying what everybody else must be thinking, you know,
Yeah.
that there are no original Doobie Brothers in this room at this point, you
Hmm.
know. Tyran wasn't even there. Tyran, you know, if Tyran and John Hartman had even still been there, there would have been some link to the past, you know.
Yeah.
But and I just questioned the idea that, you know, who, you know, I realized that there's a lot of us, there's a lot of people outside the band that are, this is their livelihood. There's like
Yeah.
30, 40 people that worked for this organization. And this is hard to say, but, you know, without Pat, uh, are we really the Doobie Brothers? anymore? Are we just, a kind of a cover band of the Doobie Brothers? And is that really fair to the audience, And so we called it that day, and that was it. I never heard from
Hmm.
anybody again for a while. And I, I think maybe some guys perceived it as, oh, he wants to go off and do his solo thing now,
Yeah.
and that really wasn't it for me. I was apprehensive about the whole solo thing. I never wanted to do the solo thing.
Well, why not? Why didn't you want to be a solo artist?
I was just happy being a Doobie Brother.
Was
I really,
stardom
I really
not,
didn't have
there
any
was
great.
no appeal to being like, I don't know, a star or in any way or
Well,
famous or,
once I was committed to the idea, I thought, well, hopefully I'll do an album that's good enough to get on the radio and I can start touring with my own band. But it wasn't like that was my main motive for
yeah.
leading rehearsal that day, or it really was just about the fact that, you know, the Doobie Brothers are not they don't exist anymore, and none of us here are prepared to take over the leadership role in front the band now that Pat's gone. I certainly wasn't. Um, it wasn't like we really had a natural capacity among between all of us to carry this thing on. But and the solo album deal I got was really Warner's idea, at the time, and um, I had done the album with Teddy and Lenny Waronker, and they did a great job of producing it. But it seemed like every album I was hoping to do, I was hoping to catch that ledge, that
Yeah.
I could kind of stand on and then develop as a solo artist. But it seemed every album kind of fell under that ledge and didn't quite get there. Uh, and I was not exactly thought of as a going concern as far as touring acts goes,
You couldn't get interest from promoters?
not much, and I
Yeah.
did put the band together and play and tour a little bit, but I don't think at the end of that tour anybody saw me as a real, oh yeah, we gotta make an even bigger tour with this guy.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, okay, uh, I uh, I had a great band. Edgar Winter, Willie Weeks on bass,
Yeah.
Chuck Shirley on drums, Robin Ford on guitar, Brian Mann on keyboards, Edgar Winter,
And you
on.
had a hit. I mean, I keep forgetting every time you're near. A lot of people will recognize that song, later generations, of course, because Warren G used that in his song Regulate. Um, and so there was, but by the way, what did you make of that, of how it was used in Regulate?
Oh, well, when I first heard it, I didn't, my kids loved it, that was all I really could, the only way I could really gauge it was.
Because that was a massive song. I
It was
mean,
a massive hit. Yeah,
yeah,
I didn't, really participate in that financially that much. They paid us a fee to use the sample, and that was about it. But uh, I remember my kids, to them, they preferred Warren's version much over mine. Uh, and but it was interesting to see that that was the beginning of that whole kind of phenomena of sampling and
yes.
hip hop, using older records to build new copyrights on and stuff. So that all had to be sorted out yet, in terms of how the business model worked on that.
You
Uh,
had, sorry, keep going.
no, so anyway, but with each record, I felt like I was gaining more in my own identity with myself than I
Yeah.
was with an audience or any kind of commercial success. Oh, I had a couple hits from different records, and then Sweet Freedom and On My Own were certainly
With Patti LaBelle on my
wonderful,
own, great
yeah,
track.
wonderful opportunities
And
for
Sweet
me.
Freedom from Running Scared. I love that. Remember that movie? Remember that video?
Yeah.
Great song.
And so those things sustained me during that whole period of time and it allowed me to go out and tour. And so we
Yeah.
started to build our touring audience out there, and little by little, like, but I'm kind of grateful for the time being because I wasn't working that much. I was touring a little bit and then a little more and then a little more, and then until
Yeah.
I didn't feel like what would you would actually call a summer season of touring. But during that time, my son was little and my daughter had just been born, so it gave me a chance to be home with them, and that was a blessing, for me. And
I
I
want.
think if I
Yeah.
had the opportunity to tour, if there had been any kind of demand for me to do it, I would have felt compelled to do that. I would have felt like I needed to go out and uh, make that opportunity work for all the people involved, not just myself, but all my managers and agents and the band and all that. You always have a certain sense of responsibility to the people you work with as much as anything you're trying to accomplish yourself.
Yeah. Michael, I'm curious about this period in your life. I mean, on the one hand, you were making a lot of music that was reaching, I mean, On My Own and Sweet Freedom, and you were making music, but that period of time, or maybe slightly before that, the mid '80s, you've described as the worst, lowest point in in your career. And at the time, you told in an interview, you said I would have been dead by the '90s if I'd carried on like that. You were, abusing drugs and alcohol. Tell me what was going on in your life, at the time. How why do you th it's a complicated question, how did that happen? But I wonder what you make of your own experience.
Really, it just comes down to I was an addict. I was prone to addiction, and for there's probably all kinds of psychological reasons, but I think it really has to do with I came from a long line of people who drinking was a problem.
Mm,
It's not for me to say who, but my great uncles and not all of them, but a couple of them were you know notoriously controlled by the John Barleycorn, um and I because of that, I remember as a kid thinking I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to
yeah,
smoke cigarettes and I'm not going to drink because it doesn't look to really agree with people. And I remember as a kid thinking that men usually passed away in their 60s. Only women lived to be in their 80s because
mm,
most of the men of that generation of the Great War generation, my grandfather and his brothers, who all were in World War One, um, they a lot of them had died drinking. Uncle
yeah,
Britt and my Uncle Edgar, and and in my family, alcohol was not talked about. It was like we don't talk about that,
yeah,
like most Irish Catholic families. It was like, if you could sweep it under the rug, or be in denial of it, however you had to manage that, that's what you did. You didn't talk about it, and certainly didn't let it, you know, sneak out the front door too many any more than you had to. Uh, but they were wonderful people. There was nothing wrong with them. They just had a problem with alcohol at some point in their lives, and I did too.
yeah,
If I look back on it, to sit around looking for the reasons and try to analyze my way out of that, all I have to really understand is that I'm an addict, and uh, I have to take life one day at a time and live it in a way today that precludes me from feeling the need to pick up a drink because
yeah.
if I get in the ring with this thing again by myself, I'm going to get my ass kicked. It's just that simple, and so I'm grateful, I'm grateful to God that I'm beyond that today. Where I don't know where I'll be tomorrow. None of us do, but
Yeah.
uh,
But you've been sober. I mean, I think you became sober shortly before the birth of your first kid, right? I
yeah,
mean,
about a year before he was born. In '86 was when I got sober.
wow.
And
How
and
did you, yeah,
I take no credit for that, other than I was lucky enough to have one of those non-coincidences, that happened in my life. That I remember distinctly the moment that I don't think there was enough willpower, rather, in the entire cosmos. If I could have mustered it all in a moment, I wouldn't have been able to beat my addictions.
Hmm.
It just wasn't going to happen until I got to that place where I accepted that total defeat, and I was never going to, I think outthink this thing,
Yeah.
never going to rise above it, that I was beaten, that was the beginning of where I could actually, face the next day, and then every day after that, hopefully with minus alcohol and drugs, and like I said, the reason I say I don't take any credit for it is if I started taking credit for it, I'd probably be drinking again pretty quick.
So who or what gets the credit?
Um, you know, uh, I think I'd have to say a higher power than me, and it presents itself to me on many levels. It presents itself to me on the people I choose to associate with today. But yeah, I think life for all of us is basically an ongoing conversation with God, however you understand God, and it's not for me to say that how you should understand God. I'm not sure how I understand God. I've never believed in God more because I got to that place where I knew I didn't have it in me, and that God, in whatever form he took in my life, did for me what I could not do for myself. Of that, I have no doubt,
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't need a picture ID of God. I don't need a conditional relationship with God where he's a certain sex or she's a certain sex or was born on a certain day. I just believe that God is unfathomable, and I'm okay with that. My experience has been that I've always had to trade whatever God I had on a bigger God as life uh, required. I do, and it's brought me closer to a belief that if I can get through today somehow in connection with a God of my understanding today, which is the God I don't understand, but then that whatever the will of that consciousness is the best shot I've got at living this life, and uh, having all the reasons in the world to be grateful. I find that I really have to remind myself by way of the people I associate with. I'm reminded to be grateful, and when I'm in a
Yeah.
state of gratitude, uh, that's when it's the easiest for me to live this life.
Michael, I'm curious about your songwriting process because you have, from what I understand, you suffer through a little bit of a curse of perfectionism, which can be a huge hindrance to the creative process. When you're so focused on getting everything right, it can really slow things down because you're scared not to get it right. Do you still suffer from that? And if not, how have you worked to overcome this obstacle of perfectionism?
I don't know that I think of myself as a perfectionist. I would just be happy if I had a decent idea once in a while. I mean, that's really more my fear is that.
You don't think you have decent ideas?
Well, I do ultimately, get one or two, and then I wrestle it to the ground, and hopefully don't ruin it before, I mean, that's really, I'm being honest with you. I feel like, that concept of what a good song is that that's the ever elusive thing. It's not the perfect song that I'm worried about. It's just what is a a sincere and good song? What is a song
Yeah.
that another person's going to hear and go, wow, yeah, I identify with that. I get that, Um, those are hard to come by for me. I'm not a prolific writer. I'm not that guy that I've written with guys in Nashville that they go in every day and they write a song
Yeah.
every day.
Yeah.
Uh, and they're good. most of them are good songs. That's not me. There's songs I've been writing for years that I don't know if I'll ever finish, but
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for the rest of the idea to formulate in my head. And I do that a lot with songs. I wait for the song to write itself. I'll get an idea for a song and I don't push it. I don't try to finish it. I'll just, it's like a cat playing with uh, you know, a balloon or something. I just kind of knock it around in the air, hoping that it'll reveal itself to me.
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens when I'm behind the wheel.
Hmm.
I remember when I was taken to the streets, I was driving home from a club gig and just, I knew what the chorus musically should kind of do, but I really didn't know what the title should be. And, uh, and it just kind of fell into my lap and while I was driving. And that happens quite a few times to me. That seems to be a space where my brain unlocks itself and things become apparent to me that might not if I wasn't preoccupied with driving. You know,
Yeah.
uh, it taken to the streets just popped in my head, and I thought that's it. That's the refrain. That's the song. That's the
Yeah.
title. And that's happened to me many times. I would go out and I'd have some melodies on a cassette or something back in the days when we used cassettes, and I would hear myself mumbling and it would sound like I said something. And all of a sudden I go, well, phonetically, that sounds really good. Or I wouldn't have made that noise when I was
Yeah.
playing the chords. But it sounded like I said this. And all of a sudden I realized, well, that's the lyric, it would be almost by accident that I would come up with the idea of. And then, of course, I write with other people too. So a lot of times they finish the ideas that, I might start. But it takes my collaboration with them to really see the song come through. I remember with What a Fool Believes, I had the piano kind of movement in the verse, and some lyrics. I had written them on an envelope coming from New York and kind of kept the envelope on my piano and I had, the bop bop ba da da bop da da. I just knew that I wanted something that felt like that.
Mm.
And it reminded me of some old R&B and gospel songs that I always liked, and some of the Four Seasons early cuts. It reminded me of that too. And it was something somewhere between that kind of early pop music and the R&B music that I heard in St. Louis growing up, and gospel music I'd heard that
Yeah.
it was, just some vague idea of how this record might sound when we got it done. And I played it for Teddy Templeman. And
Mm.
as soon as I played him that little bit I had, he goes, man, he goes, that is a hit. I'm telling you,
Mm.
you got to finish that. And I remember saying, I promise. And of course, I never did, for like a year. I was just,
Wow.
every once in a while, I'd get together with him and I'd play him that. He go, play me that thing again. You think you play? And I'd play it. And he's maybe the only reason I actually remembered it. But he always just, he'd always say, man, you please finish that, whatever you do. So I had gotten Tyran Porter had passed along Kenny Loggins' number to me. He said he had run into Kenny and Kenny expressed some interest in writing with me. Would he give me his number? So I called Kenny and we made a date to get together at my house. So my sister got wind of it. Of course, she came up with to clean my bachelor filthy house. It was like ashtrays piled with cigarettes on the piano and half empty everything, glasses with mold, I mean, it was awful. I was a slob. And so I was going through some ideas, notebooks, looking for anything that might be something, a germ of some idea that I wrote down that I could maybe start with if we didn't know what else to do. So there might be something in these notebooks or some cassette, idea. And I remember I had that little piece of piano music and how Ted loved it. And I was playing things for my sister, and she was like, "Oh, that's good, But she's feverishly cleaning up my house around me, and before Kenny got there, I was just hoping I'd come up with some ideas to have in my arsenal, And I played her that bit of the verse of "What a Fool Believes." She kind of looked at me and she just got, "Well, yeah, you know, that's okay, And right then the doorbell rang, and she freaked because she had her Longs and Messina albums and her Sharpie there, ready to, get Kenny to sign them. And so I went to the door and opened the door, and here's Kenny with a bag full of notebooks and tape recorder and his guitar, and I could see he was kind of struggling. So I took his guitar or one of the things, and I said, "Here, let me help you." And I came on in. I said, "Man, I'm so excited about getting together." He goes, "Before we say anything," he goes, "You were just playing something on the piano." He goes, "Is that something new?" And I said,
Hmm.
"Well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I was playing for my sister uh, because I was hoping that maybe it might be something we could work on." He goes, "Perfect." He goes, "I want to start with that."
Hmm.
He had already written the the B section of the song outside the door before I even opened it,
Wow.
because he heard me playing the piano thing, and immediately in his head he went to the "She had a place in her life," and without the words, but he knew the melody had to go
Yeah.
something like that. And so I showed him the words I had, and so then we came up with the words for that section, and we didn't have a chorus till the next day. We left it unfinished, thinking we got to have a good chorus on this.
Yeah.
And so he went on home back to Santa Barbara. The next morning, I was messing around with some ideas. I called him. We got on the phone, and I don't know what part of that I think it was the key change. I thought, this might be an interesting place to go musically. And what are we talking about here with the song? And it seemed the culmination of the idea of the lyrics was two people who were looking back on the same event in their lives with totally different ideas of what actually happened.
Yeah.
Guys thinking that it was this long lost great love of his that he might have a chance at rekindling. And to her, he was barely on the radar, you know, and
Yeah.
he was just an old friend that she agreed to have dinner with and had no inclination whatsoever to
Hmm.
rekindle this affair. And so she just says her goodnights and leaves. And he's left with this, still believing in his heart that maybe there's a chance, because what a fool believes, no wise man has the power to reason away.
Yeah.
So, that's how that song came about. And, but for Kenny, I probably would still be something I'd play for Teddy Templeman every once in a while and he'd
Wow.
chastise me for not having finished.
Michael, one of the things that I love about um you is you've kind of over the years, I think it's a fondness for your voice, and obviously have been a highly sought after vocalist on so many records, Christopher Cross and so many others, Carly Simon. Um, and over the years, there's been sort of parody tributes to you, right? There's a famous one that Rick Moranis did on Second City TV, SCTV in the '80s, where
Yeah.
it's Michael McDonald driving from one studio to another just at the right time, getting there and singing the right lyric for "Ride Like the Wind." Such a long way to go. Sorry, and then you yourself did something with Jimmy Fallon and Justin Timberlake many years ago, where you all three are Michael McDonald. They've got gray, beards and hair, and you're seeing "Row Row Row Your Boat," and it seems like you really appreciate and enjoy. You kind of like that kind of poking a little bit.
I do. I mean, I think I'm flattered that anyone even bothers. You know, my kids always got a big kick out of like the Family Guy and any parodies.
Yeah, right. Family Guy. Yep.
On
Yep.
the Yacht Rock when it was in its earliest stages as a viral thing on the computers online, and we would sit and laugh for hours at this stuff, and so it was I've always told my son too, who is a musician songwriter, and I'd say, hey, listen, when your music becomes less relevant, as everyone's music does at some point, your pathetic comic value may come in handy. So, don't laugh. But I, uh, I remember the Rick Moranis thing. I came into my room that night. I had been with Pat Simmons, and after the gig, we came back to his room, and he said to me, he goes, "Man, I got this joint that you're not going to believe this stuff." He goes, "It's you can't smoke very much of it. It's like psychedelic." And he and I went to his room, and we're just kind of shooting the breeze, and I took a couple hits off this joint. And I remember I got kind of scary high. I remember it was kind of like, I said, "Pat, I got to go to my room and lay down." I said, I'm way too high right now. And I left his room, and I used to leave my TV on in my motel room so that somebody wouldn't break in while we were at the shows, and or they'd think someone was there. And when I came into the room, that Rick Moranis bit was in process on SCTV.
Hmm.
It's playing out on the television, and I'm thinking, am I really losing it? That guy looks really familiar. And there's playing this Christopher Cross song, and I started to get the gist of the skit, and I'm thinking that I'm having a flashback or something, and it just was the most surreal experience as I can remember. And then I realized it was a joke and it was a skit, and I actually ran into Rick Moranis backstage with the Rock and Soul Review. He came down to see the show with Donald and Walter and Boz Scaggs and Phoebe Snow and everybody. And he actually apologized to me for the skit. I said,
Oh,
no. I said, I loved every minute of it. Uh, and yeah, those are just those good fun for me.
yeah,
40-year-old virgin. It was I enjoyed
right.
all that.
Right. 40, I forgot. Michael, you are immortalized in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You're there. You're in there. When you think about how you want, like, if there is, if you ever think about it, like a legacy or how you want people to remember you or your music, in 30 or 40 years from now, how do you want to be remembered?
Uh, I think my designs for the music industry, wanting to be a part of the record industry, I guess is what it was, making records as an artist. Um, I think the only way I really care about being remembered is if I'm that record that comes on your radio on your oldies channel, and you reach over and crank it up, while you're driving. And I bring that kind of joy to you that so many times artists brought to me when I was in my
Yeah.
car. Just crank the radio because, oh, there's that song, and I remember where I was when I heard that song and all that stuff that comes with it. That's the real legacy. I even when early on when I first got to California, I remember going into office buildings for whatever reason, and there'd be music on the elevators.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, if I ever hear one of my songs on music, I'll know I made it. Because it was all these, great 101 strings playing Burt Bacharach, and
Yeah.
so that was kind of like a dream of mine, is to get on an elevator someday and hear one. Right.
What a dream.
Yeah, but I mean, mostly it's just that idea that I could bring an inkling of the joy that all those artists in the '60s brought me. When
Yeah.
I was young, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think has there been music? There must be music made of your work.
I think there was minute by
Yeah,
minute I heard music.
I'm sure.
And I felt like I could die now.
Yeah. Michael McDonald, thank you so much.
Man, thank you, Guy. I appreciate it. It's been fun talking to you.
Hey, thanks so much for watching my conversation with Michael McDonald. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to this channel. We post new conversations every single week. And of course, we are an audio podcast too. Just search for The Great Creators wherever you listen to podcasts, and please click follow so you never miss a new episode. I'm Guy Raz. This has been The Great Creators from Built Up Productions. We will be back right here with another episode next week. See you then.